So it's also a pleasure for me to have the opportunity to introduce Justin. Justin Giboney runs the AND campaign, whose mission is to educate and organize Christians for civic and cultural engagement that results in better representation, more just and compassionate policies, and a healthier political culture. Justin is an attorney and political strategist in Atlanta, Georgia. He's been twice elected by Democrats in Georgia's 5th District to represent them as a delegate to the DNC. He co-chaired Obama for America's Gen 44 Atlanta initiative and has been involved in many different civic efforts in Atlanta more broadly. And I just want to note how much I appreciate Justin's leadership, his activism, and his integrity in the way he usually challenges his audiences in new ways. Not to put you on the spot, Justin, but we're very glad you're here. Thank you.
Well, I thank you for that introduction, Chris. I greatly appreciate it, and appreciate your friendship and the many things that you've done as well. So thank you for having me. I also want to make sure that I just thank PACE. I'm grateful to be part of this conversation. I would like to thank Kristen and Diane Douglas for having me, and just say that I appreciate the work that PACE does, how they open the door for a diverse group of voices to have a say into this conversation when we're talking about civic engagement. And that's very important because we have to be thoughtful and deliberate about our civic engagement. We can't leave it to those whose careers, finances, and ambitions are tied up in political office or partisan politics. And when I say that, I promise you, I'm not impugning those people. We need them too. But we have to, if we're gonna have balance, we also need people who are coming from a very different point of view. Really people who are approaching this conversation from a place of being a concerned citizen. That perspective and motive is essential in maintaining a healthy democracy. And I don't think we should lose that. So those people not only have to be involved, but really to help shape democracy. We need everyday Americans to be involved in that shaping process in the civic space. And the great thing about being part of this conversation today is that PACE gets that. And PACE not only talks about it, but does what they can to make sure that those who are putting their voices into those spaces and trying to shape it in a constructive way, trying to make sure that those people are heard. And again, I can't help but thank you for that. So the question before me today, as I understand it, is how can faith increase our capacity to shape society for the better? Or put another way, how might politics change if faith was understood as a civic muscle, as something that enhanced our ability to be architects of democracy? And that's an important question because, as we heard earlier, faith sometimes doesn't necessarily seem like an asset, but I think a good case can be made, and you heard it from Michael earlier, who I'd like to thank also, Michael Ware. A good case can be made that faith is indeed, when done right, faith is indeed an asset to democracy. In my preparation for this conversation, which I enjoyed, I really found it just to be a worthwhile investigation. And maybe the most helpful place to start when we're getting into this is the present circumstances. We know that when it comes to politics and civics, we are in a very interesting moment. And I think we need to apply this conversation to the moment at hand. Because today, especially on our national stage, faith is often used in a sense, but less often earnestly utilized in a constructive way. And so I do want to affirm that faith is not always used in a very constructive way. And I think that's unfortunate because we're not realizing its potential. Some of our national political figures, and I think this happens on both sides, will selectively wear the trappings of the faith to identify with or to relate to certain devout groups. But if you look closely, the faith is more of an adornment than a core and substantive part of their civic practices. The role of faith in civic engagement shouldn't just be about our policy positions. It should be about how we interact in the political sphere in general. Our faith shouldn't be just reflected in how we vote, but also in how we conduct ourselves in the rest of the civic process. It should be reflected in how we address our opponents, and how we maintain our institutions, how we hold our representatives accountable, and how we respond when we lose. What's an acceptable course of action when we lose an election or policy debate? And I'm almost certain that everyone on this call, on this video call, has experienced that. That pain in the pit of your stomach when the candidate that you thought should win actually lost, or when that policy that you really thought that was best for America and best for those around you, when it failed. To talk about that, we don't need to minimize those moments. Those are important things, and there are lives and rights on the line when we talk about those issues. But what I think we need to get to is, what does that allow us to do, right? Does that allow us to become agents of chaos and destruction? Does it allow us to throw civic temper tantrums when we lose? And when I say civic temper tantrums, I'm not talking about protest or advocacy, but I'm talking about trading insult for insult, covering our ears and hardening our hearts because we believe that the other side is irredeemable, incapable of virtuous or thoughtful solutions. Much too often today, faith serves partisan demands rather than faith restricting where we allow partisanship to take us. It serves the transient causes of the moment rather than binding us to higher principles that restrain our impulses. And that's what I think for some we will see it has done. Many voters, unfortunately, have allowed political affiliation to become religious in nature. And I think this is very dangerous because political affiliation isn't the equivalent of a solid foundation of faith. It doesn't keep us grounded in something that's unchanging. It doesn't keep us grounded in something that is rock solid. Political affiliation, if we're all going to be honest, can be tainted. It can be fickle and often in a state of flux. It demands our devotion. We know that, but it doesn't demand intellectual honesty. It doesn't demand humility, and a devoted and sincere faith does. Our partisan tribes thrive off of polarization, endearing us not to higher principles, again, as I would say faith does, but they endear us through cynicism and by cultivating fear of and disdain for political opponents. Too many Americans have bought into the narrative that everything our political opponents do is aimed to either deceive, hurt, or control us. Now, I would be naive if I sat here and told you right now that that never was the case. But there's a serious danger in making that a constant assumption. I would go so far as to say that is a mortally cynical position. A democracy can't survive if that's our primary supposition. Because when we believe that everything coming from the other side is meant to either deceive, hurt, or control us, then even the most sensible directive coming from the other side becomes a ploy to unduly restrict our freedom or generally harm our person. Wearing a mask, for instance, becomes a matter of liberty. And then on the other side, we must prevent our opponents from even speaking because their words are now violence. Under those terms, we can't have a healthy discussion or debate. There's only room for demolition. There's only room for eliminating others and their opinions from the conversation. Things will only get better when they no longer exist, not when we come to an agreement and decide to build together. That's not even on the table. We even start, and I've noticed this, we even start to falsely find virtue in defying the other side's every instruction or belief. Because if everything they do is bad, then doing the opposite must be good. And this empty defiance invariably leads us into absurd territory because it is opposition centered. It's not centered around a greater principle or something that's transcendent. Again, these are things that faith brings to the table. The data even shows that we more often vote against something or against someone rather than for something or for someone. And in that case, our political positions aren't attached to any kind of moral anchor. They're just relative to our political opponent's position and their location. And then we stake out our position at the polar opposite end of the spectrum. This is not the fruit of faith. This is actually something that dismantles democracy rather than building and shaping it to fit a greater objective. But I think that if we look at history, there's one historical figure in particular who speaks to how faith can increase our capacity to do good work in the civic space, to use faith as civic muscle, not simply a tool, but a guide, a motive, and a faculty. As many of us already know, Frederick Douglass was an abolitionist, he was an orator, and he was a writer. Douglass was born into slavery, and very early on in his life, he was separated from his mother. We can imagine how traumatic that would be. On more than one occasion, he was viciously beaten to break his spirit, to weaken his resolve to be more than society told him he was. He was beaten to crush his desire to be treated with dignity. And miraculously, those attempts failed. Douglass, a former slave, would speak prophetically to large audiences and advise an American president. You might have heard the Frederick Douglass quote, "I would unite with anybody to do right and with nobody to do wrong." Now that's cute and it might sound somewhat pedestrian or trite, but when placed in the context of when he said it and why he said it, it's actually quite extraordinary. Douglass made that statement during a lecture in Rochester, New York in 1855. And what he was saying was that he would partner with the American Anti-Slavery Society to abolish slavery, but he would not support their effort to abolish the government or the union as a whole. You see, that organization's motto was "No union with slaveholders." They believed that the Constitution was a slaveholding instrument, thus it had to be abolished. They had to abolish the country for the sake of emancipation. They kind of had a burn it all down to the ground mentality. And even though Douglass cared a lot about abolition, he wasn't going along with that. Douglass understood the flaws of the Constitution. He understood the blind spots of the founders. He understood the urgency and imperative of ending this demonic institution, for he was a slave himself, so he could never be accused of not understanding the urgency of the moment. But he believed the Constitution opened the door and provided the apparatus to abolish slavery. As badly as Douglass wanted slavery to end, he had the understanding and the foresight to see that it could be done, that it could be abolished without discarding the Constitution and the Union as a whole. Douglass saw an opportunity to build, and he made a deliberate choice to be a builder. He saw the possibility of redemption. Douglass had exactly what our political discourse is missing. Because he was a sincere man of faith, he had moral imagination. Moral imagination is an attribute of earnest and mature faith. It's the ability not just to see what has been historically, it's the ability not just to see what is presently, but to envision what could be, to envision what ought to be. And not simply at your opponent's expense, but ultimately for their benefit. We talk over and over again today about how everything would be perfect if we just got rid of the other side, if they just somehow disappeared or we found some way to get them out of the way and not have to worry about them. But that's not what moral imagination will get you. You see, in the worst of times, it takes moral imagination to do what's right. And that's very different than simply doing what seems to serve your interest at the moment. It takes moral imagination not to have an opposition-centered public witness in a polarized environment. It takes moral imagination to see what the moment is hiding from you. Moral imagination prevents us from being enslaved by the moment. And if we look at both sides of this political conversation in America today, it's hard to say that they can see past this very moment. And that's not to say the moment isn't important. That's not to say the moment won't be consequential. It certainly will be. But faith forces us to ask, what is this moment hiding from me? What don't I see that I need to see in this very important moment in time? We must ask those questions. Faith produces moral imagination, and moral imagination affords us the vision, aspiration, and determination necessary to build a better civic space, even when the prospects of doing so are irrational. Even when there's no strong argument to be made to believe that it can happen because you believe in something bigger than the moment, bigger than you, bigger than your group. It allows us to see and understand what we have in common, even with someone who is taunting us. It forces us in those very tough moments to recall that everyone has a story, that everyone has a testimony, and that everyone has human dignity, even if their anger or their circumstances hide it. Frederick Douglass wasn't one of those people who wanted to silence his opposition. He didn't even want to silence a slave apologist. He wanted to debate them because the merits of the case were on his side. And he believed that he could persuade those who were listening in good faith. He believed that there were enough people who would listen in good faith to make a change. But if you listen to the story that I told, it wasn't him just talking to the other side. This was Frederick Douglass checking his own side. How often do we see that? In a serious moment, usually our kind of mob mentality tells us that we can never question our own side because it'll weaken our case. But even when freedom was on the line, Frederick Douglass's faith told him to say no. Right is still right, and wrong is still wrong. I will not do wrong with anyone, whether you're close to me or not. That's faith. The civil rights movement was an exercise of moral imagination. It was the demonstration of the vision and endurance necessary to build any great work of civic architecture. It was the most muscular public display of democracy shaping this country has witnessed. It didn't overlook the present, but it also wasn't limited by the present because it was faith-led, faith-centered. When civil rights freedom fighters sang about keeping their eyes on the prize, they were not talking about a prize that they could physically see. They were referring to a prize that had to be imagined through the lens of faith. They were describing a telos not blurred by the myopia of the present, that even when their eyes were swollen shut by batons, or when their eyes were blinded by tear gas, they still could see the reward of a faithful and dignified public witness. And that's not something that comes out of nowhere. It comes from something greater than you, a belief in something larger than your circumstances, larger than the power back and forth in those power exchanges. And what they saw allowed them to begin to correct and shape a derelict nation, a nation that couldn't be repaired by the tools of just materialism or rugged individualism. The tools in those toolboxes were insufficient for the moment, for people who outside of faith had no rational, logical reason to believe that they would get out of the situation they were in. And they forced a nation to more acutely understand and apply the principles it had already professed. This is why I think faith is a strong civic muscle, because it gives us that moral imagination to see something that is invisible right in front of us. Thank you for this opportunity.
I need to sit with that for a second. Thank you, Justin. That was incredibly powerful and so much to think about. I want to open it up for questions to Justin, and then we will have some time for some small group conversations as well. But if anyone actually has words right now, I don't. But if anybody else does and you want to ask a question to Justin, please feel free to unmute yourself and do that.
Hey, Justin. This is Andrew Hanauer with the One America Movement. Thanks for that. It was awesome. You know, our organization works with people way on the other sides of the spectrum. And one of the issues that we get asked about a lot are litmus tests, which I think speaks to the quote that you referenced from Douglas. How do you in your work think about litmus tests, and how do you navigate that sort of the culture of the litmus test?
Yeah, I think we have to approach it with skepticism. I think we really do have to approach these litmus tests with skepticism, because I think they can really be a tool of the mob mentality that I was telling you about. And this brings back in the conversation of faith. I think the beauty of faith is that it brings in another level of scrutiny, right? So it's not just what my group is saying at the time, what my political party is saying at the time. No, I have to run this through biblical scrutiny, or the scrutiny of, what we do in other faith traditions. It forces you to do that. And so I think we should all, we should be very skeptical of those litmus tests, because we know that they go wrong. And we know that they are not very good, or can't understand at all nuance, right? And understanding a situation that has changed, and they're just easy tools to create a situation where we're not really looking at the substance or the content. We're just being very dogmatic in a bad sense, right? On things that may not necessarily fit into the best interest and the common good of what's going on. I think groups and folks who are trying to create that mob mentality or use the mob mentality, that's one of the main tools in that toolbox. And so we have to be skeptical and run it past other levels of scrutiny.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Other questions for Justin?
I have a question for Justin about the role that particularly faith leaders and clergy play in this conversation, and the ease with which clergy get entrapped in the energy and the enthusiasm and perhaps the ego of political activism on one side or the other. And I'm wondering if you have had any experience or luck perhaps preaching the message of greater scrutiny and staying true to one's faith roots to other faith leaders in your denomination or other denominations. What's been your experience amongst colleagues?
Right. So I usually say this, and I think that's a great question. I usually say this: regardless of what party you think is best, regardless of what ideological tribe you follow, they do not meet the standards of your faith, right? There's something that's missing from that, and you have to be able to identify it. So when I talk to faith leaders, whether they are conservative or more progressive, I say, before we really engage in these conversations and you go out and you promote these, one side or the other, make sure that you have identified the issues with that side. Make sure that you communicate that you've identified the issues on your side, so that your people know that you're not indoctrinated, right? So that they know that you're actually thinking critically, and that again, you run it through the biblical scrutiny or whatever other faith tradition that you have, so that they can trust what you say. Now that works on both ends, right? That works for the audience. It gives them a bit of a sense that you actually have done the homework and that you're not just following behind some ideology or partisanship. But it also is for them internally, right? Because it makes sure that they've actually thought through it in a way that sometimes we don't. And the hard part about it, and what we have to realize, is that these are pressing issues. And so when people get passionate about these issues, it's for a reason, because usually they're impacting people and they're important. But I still think that we have to step back and say, where could this go wrong? Do I understand, the logical conclusion of where this is going? And if there's a point that I need to stop before it gets there, have I articulated that before I start bringing people along with me? Such an important conversation to have, but I think that's a great question. And those are the kind of things that I bring up to leaders before they get out in front of those issues, because a lot of folks jump on a bandwagon and aren't exactly sure where the next stop is. And so we got to make sure that we stay away from that.
Thanks. Thank you so much.
I've got a quick question. This is Itai Dinor. Thank you. That was really powerful, Justin. I'm curious. Are there any trends that you're seeing based on generation or age?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm mostly in the Christian space, so I can speak from there. But I think a lot of young people, number one, they're asking a lot more questions, and they're seeking a concept of justice, right? They understand the importance of justice. There's kind of an activist spirit, and they're seeking a true concept of justice. And what I tell faith leaders is, you're going to have to provide that. You're going to have to fill in the gaps there. You're going to have to make sure that you flesh out what justice means for your faith tradition. Because if you don't flesh that out for them, they're going to find it elsewhere. And most of these faith traditions have strong understandings of what justice is, but also what it isn't. And where today we may go a little further or fall short of what it really should be. But if we're unable to articulate that, that's a problem. I'll take, for instance, some white evangelicals who just run away from anything that says social justice. Well, you can do that, but that doesn't make the younger generations run away from it, right? They see the flaw in that. And so I say the better thing to do is to show them the right way to do it rather than to run away from it, right? Because it's still there, the issues are still there, and you lose credibility when you don't address them in an honest way.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And it makes me think about the context of the litmus test question as well, right? Because the sort of idea of how do you help them, but also how do you prepare them for, how does clergy, how do faith leaders prepare young people for this idea of the other side, like not demonizing the other side, right? You can have accountability and humanity at the same time.
I think that's perfect. And a lot of times we demonize the other side, partially because we're lazy, right? Partially because we know we don't want them to go over there, but we don't want to take the time to show them the humanity, and we just err on the side of demonization, where I really think we have to take the time and say, hey, this is where we disagree, but guess what? Look at what we've gotten wrong in the past and all these things. We have substantive disagreements, and that's why I disagree sometimes with the left when it comes to faith. We don't have to say that every faith is the same. I mean, you would have to take away the understanding of the supernatural and all those things. We don't have to say they're the same, but we can have a pluralistic understanding and appreciation, identify the differences, and then find common ground. But I do think sometimes either being lazy or just unaware of how to address it, we don't get to, we don't really, we dehumanize as a shortcut to making sure that they don't flirt with things we wouldn't want them to flirt with.
Thank you.
I think we probably have time for one more question before we break into small groups with the grantees, if anybody has one.
Justin, I would love to jump in and just say a huge thank you for spending time with us today. Not to tip my hand, but I think Krista and I were back channeling of like, oh my gosh, I have chills. This is a very emotional pace meeting today. So thank you for being thoughtful and for spending that time. Something that stood out to me from your talk was around how Frederick Douglass had faith not only in his message, but in the capacity of his audience to have open hearts, to be able to hear and act on the message that he was giving. And I'm curious how you think that translates to today. And if you think that we are in a situation where, honestly, hearts are just as open as they were then. I mean, battling slavery, I'm sure that it felt like hearts were fairly closed at that time period. So I don't want to, make false comparisons, but, how you feel about the ability for people to hear messages and, any advice you have on kind of laying the groundwork to make sure that the important messages of our time are able to be heard and acted upon.
I think it's just the key to being faithful. I mean, to be faithful, to being hopeful, right? In order to be hopeful, I really can't believe that everybody on the other side is stupid or whatever, all the things that we say about the other side, right? I really have to say that there are enough people here that if I say what's right and do what's right, they will listen. I have to believe that. Otherwise, we can't have an intellectually honest conversation. And a lot of that goes on today. And I always push back against they don't know what's good for them. They don't know, they're this and they're that. No. That could be true in some instances, or people that you see that are kind of the characters that you see. But in general, there are very intelligent people on all sides of the conversation in every demographic. And sometimes they just have different priorities than you. And so I think we just have to have a core belief, again, whether we can see it in the moment or not, right? A core belief that if I tell the truth, if I'm intellectually honest, and I have the merits on my side, that there will be enough people to hear me, or at least to plant the seed, right? And that's something else that you saw in the civil rights movement, that I'm at very least planting the seed for things to grow later on. It takes faith for that to matter, because it takes faith to say, well, that seed, even though I'm not going to see it, is going to benefit humanity after I'm gone. And I think that's what we're missing, to say, even if I don't see it today, even if I can't convince those people over there today that this is right, I'm planting a seed that will benefit people after me. And I think it takes a level of faith for that to be of value. And so I think that's the answer to the conversation. We're not going to always be able to see it, but there's hopefulness in believing in our common man, and saying there are going to be some people that listen either now or later, and I have to believe that, and I have to be honest and do it the right way.
Kristen, can I just make one comment? First of all, what a hopeful, uplifting, but realistic message. It was fabulous. I had a professor one time who was an evangelical Christian, and he said, I believe that at any one time, 30% of what I believe is heresy. And so I do my theology modestly. And he was one of the best listeners, and probably brought more people to consider his stance on faith than anyone who just did all the talking.
I think that's an excellent point. Something that I couldn't get to was humility. I think faith brings a level of humility. If there's something greater than you, if there's something that told you that you are imperfect, then you do need to step back and say, well, I could be wrong, and the consequences of me being wrong could be devastating. So I need to hear other people out. I need to not be, so abrasive in how I go about it, because I think that's exactly right. I know I've been wrong many times, and I'm thankful when people are gracious about me trying to correct that.
Thank you so much, Justin, for taking the time with us. You hit on so many different things that I think are the perfect culmination of a lot of what the learning community has been exploring and grappling with this year, and that PACE wants to take forward, particularly in the spirit of imagination.